Anyway, hi everyone, my name is Paola. I work as an experience design director for a digital product studio called Foolproof here in London. Before, I was at the Government Digital Service for 5 years, and I led content teams in various programs, including of the UK. Where I worked on the first discovery on personalization. You hear a lot about this work today. You're also going to see something about it. And it's because that specific project forced me to reevaluate a lot of things that I thought I knew about personalization. I fancied myself an expert back then, not so much afterwards. First off, though, a correction. When Rick invited me as a speaker today, I made a bet with myself that I would be able to finally put all these thoughts about personalization on paper, and actually better yet, that I could model them into a structured knowledge artifact. However, as the time passed, I realized that I was biting off a really big piece, and so I decided that it was a little bit too ambitious. Because I don't have a taxonomy. I would say that hardly I have some terminology, but I rescope my talk. However, I think it's not going to be less useful because I'm hoping today to spark someone's interest, and I'm hoping that actually today somebody will take an interest in user context and maybe run away with it and maybe build a much better model than I can ever build. Why a classification? So when we look at a very fuzzy domain as personalization, especially when it's so fluid because of technology ever evolving, it's always useful to start looking at the various dimensions. The attempts that I've seen are very much focused on the outcomes, so what happens when you personalize something. But I think that in order to define these, first you need to understand what I define as user context in this presentation. And to explain how I came to this conclusion, I need to take a step back and tell you a little bit about the discovery that I mentioned before. Now, step back, 2019, we had a brief. That brief was to understand how a Gov.uk account could make things easier for users, that is, removing friction in their wayfinding on Gov.uk. Let me start with the things we grapple with. So it was hard to explain what type of outcomes we meant when we talked about personalization. There was very little around in terms of successful use cases that we could emulate or take inspirations from. And in general, it was hard to explain to ourselves and to our stakeholders what we meant by personalization. So early on, we came up with a model that helped us a little bit to make some useful distinction. Here's that model. So this spectrum considers the data types that are used in personalization and tries to bundle together the personalization outcomes that I mentioned before. So on your right-hand side, you will see that we start with recommendations that are in the low confidence level. This is where we're not really sure who we're talking with. We have some signals, so the data type. So we might have some analytics, we have some performance, but this is where we, the automation level of the things we can do with content and information for users, it's actually quite low. So we want to be very careful with this. Also, recommendations are already happening on Gov.uk in a way right now. There are some things, and we didn't want to look at this level, so the signals and the recommendations, because we were tasked to look at what happens with an account. So the account, we go a step up, because with the account, we can look at credentials. Credentials are statements about a user. Those statements can be given by the user themselves or can be stored somehow into an account. Those credentials can give us the opportunity of dynamically assembling content. So you, for instance, if you have structured content, if you have content that's granular enough, based on those credentials, you can decide, okay, you are eligible for this thing, or you can see this other thing. So the level of automation is slightly higher because those decisions can be run by systems behind it. And then we have the really high level confidence, which is the government held data. given by the government health data, because we know that those characteristics about the users are true. Government has it, they must be true, right? And so based on these, actually, we could even automate things in the back end, because we know that someone is of a certain age and has a certain income, and so automatically we can make that decision for them to do something. It all looks great, right? Oh, it's so simple, it makes so much sense. No, it was haunting me. This wasn't working. There was something deeply wrong with it, but I couldn't tell what. So actually, when we wrapped up this project, as I said, it had actually very good outcomes, because what you see now as one login was the very early stages were the idea of actually having a digital identity that works across government. So that was great. But the personalization was sparked a little bit. However, as I said, yeah, this was the part that wasn't working for me. What I think wasn't really working is that despite doing some prototypes that hopefully I will be able to show you later, Rick will tell me if I'm really running out of time, we didn't fully understand digital identity. And this is actually where I'm restarting from today. So since leaving the program and GDS, I had some time to think about how would I define these things better, and how all of this applies to the concept of personalization in general. So today I'm presenting the super early results. They're super early. So I need some caveats now to start with. As I said, work in progress, highly objectionable. Please object, come find me, tell me that I'm wrong. I would love it. Some bits are a little bit esoteric. I'll try to explain them, but some concepts are a little bit hard to understand because it's kind of technology and technology standards set on digital identity. I will rush through things, so probably will be a little bit very speedy. And then source-wise, I'm using terminology coming from a W3C standard called verifiable credentials, talking about esoteric. And then some kudos for inspiration on personalized outcomes. I have to thank Jeff Eaton and one of his wonderful articles about it. Okay, let's jump in and see and start looking at the facets of user context. Let's start with an easy one, user attribute type. I mentioned before, I make the big distinction between signals, which are things that we get about users, but they're not really personal. So those are things that come from systems. So we know the device, we know where they're from, we know that they might have already visited this page, but it's just signals. Doesn't tell us anything about them. And then credentials, which is a fact about that specific user. Again, very generic. So this is kind of like the big facet. Then there's a facet about source. So the source, very self-explaining, self-explanatory. It can be a device. So we know that there's an iPhone. The system, so something might be held in a system, and we can get it from there. So some data held by a department about users. And then finally, the holder. Now, I'm going to define it here as the entity making the claim, and so far it's a human. This might feel a little bit weird, but with digital twins and with all the AI coming, there might be a time when actually you think it's a human, but you're actually getting things from a system, and those are inferences that the system made. So it's not something that the user has shared with you. And I think that as designers, we need to keep that in mind. Then my favorite, the privacy spectrum. And this is where I get my GDS card probably revoked for, I'm looking at faces there. Now, let me try and explain this. This is the dimension that has to do with how much the credentials shared between systems impact privacy. They're listed from high minimization, that is more privacy, and low minimization, that is less privacy. I'll probably have more explanations here. Yes, great. So I was good. So for instance, the non-correlatable, I made it really life difficult for myself today. It means that actually we can, instead of getting data from users, we can ask a specific question. Is the user older than 18? And this is very useful for systems where, for instance, I don't know, you have to sell alcohol. You don't want to know someone's name. You don't want to make sure that it's you just need to verify that. That's it. This is the principle of data minimization, which is crucial for privacy. And also, and this is where also most people want to remain anonymous. So this is also trying to adder for people's needs and wants in terms of the digital identity. On the other hand, for instance, for a medical prescription, the pharmacy fulfilling the prescription has a duty to identify who you are and might have to prod you with asking. And the same thing could happen on digital. I think that the growing, something that we need to keep in mind is the second part, correlatable via collusion, is where you can get a lot of data about a user when you have two or more data points about them. And when you combine them together, like name, date of birth, and postcode, I know that it's going to be Chris, or I know it's going to be Rick, because you have 3 data points. So you have to be really careful in the data that you pick from users. Next one, it's the level of identification. Again, this is an interesting one because we can start with returning device. This is what we can identify quite easily with analytics. But then we have 2 levels, which sometimes are a little bit confused. Because it's important to understand the difference between authorized credentials, so an account, a system account, my email, and my password. It's not me, it's an account. So those are authorized credentials. If I use that email and that password, I can get in. But it's very different from a verified identity, which is a system account with a proof of identity. And there are 2 completely different things, and things that probably we will have to deal more in the future. Enter the trust model. So as I said, we don't deal with digital identity too often these days because most systems are enclosed, a university, a company. For instance, when you get your company's email address, identity verification has happened somewhere else. So there's an implied trust in the system. You have your email, it's you. We know that. We know that every time the email gets in, we know. We hope that every time that email gets in, it's you. But there's a level of trust implicit in that. Trust resides in the fact that external entities, in theory, cannot access. But trust is a very central concept in identity and digital identity. Because any system that relies on verifying that someone is who they claim they are operates in what we call a trust model. That is one where all parties involved in verifying someone's identity trust the other parties because they use specific standards and adopt specific procedures. One example is gov.uk One Login, the identity verification system that we talked about. This is not widespread, but it's coming more and more. Especially if all this chatter on GenAI goes away, there's a lot of actually happening in digital identity. And so more and more things are happening. So this is why I think that as design, IA, professions, we need to get more familiar with this concept. So let me just do 2 quick facets around this and just explain to you some high-level concepts of the trust model. We talk about some entities. Those are the 4 main entities. So the holder is, let's say, the user, but it's the person that submits verifiable credentials. I'll get to the explanation of what verifiable credentials are. The subject is the entity that's related to those credentials. So it could be different from the holder. You could do something for your child. You could do something for your alien parent. So holder and subject are not necessarily the same. Then we have the issuer. So it's the entity that issues the credential for holder. And I will show you some examples later, no worries. And then finally, we have the verifier. So somebody that says, yes, that detail is right. This statement about this user is correct. You can trust it. And therefore, you can do things with it. The second and last facet that I want to share with you is the concept. So verifiable credential is an attribute that can be verified and exchanged in this trust ecosystem. For instance, in the case of one login, it's identity. So I can prove that it's really me. It's Paola Roccuzzo, and I can do it because they're going to check things with the Home Office or other parts of the trust system, and I can then reuse that credential because it's been made official. Then we have the verifiable presentation, which is what you get when you combine several verified credentials. So for instance, if my identity has been approved and I have another piece of data that, for instance, I'm from Italy, the system can make inferences from that. And then finally, the proof is the signature. So the tamper-proof part that sits behind the verified credential. That's what makes it real and true, and you can have confidence in it within the system. Based on this concept, I kind of turn things around. This is not right. This is definitely not right. And this is where I really want to make a lot of work. But there are a few things that I included. So for instance, I think that in personalization, there's a lot to be done in the dynamic assembly. And because things will go from inferred, so again, low confidence in who you are and what you say, to actually known. We know who you are. That sounds a little bit ominous, especially when you talk about government. But and this is where I think one of the sweet spot to hit in personalization is. But if you're known, I can also make things automated for you. I don't need you to apply for a thing that you're entitled to if I know these 3 pieces of data about you. And so the access have become verified rather than type of data and automated. And again, with this model and with digital identity, we can move away from recommendations and go definitely more towards the dynamic assembly of content. Are we doing for time? 5 minutes. Let me do it quickly. Okay. Right. So let me show you how these concepts would work because I know that I've done a lot of academia so far. Let's see it on a prototype. Now, another avalanche of caveats. So this is work coming from 2019. A lot of stuff has happened in the meantime, all the great work that Gov.uk is doing. So this was the initial thinking about how you pull everything back together. Identity, government data exchange, content on Gov.uk. So with this in mind, this is not happening. Nobody's working on it. Don't worry. Let's look at that hypothetical Gov.uk, how it looked like back then. So we have Anne, a user, who looks for information on her disability. That's gotten worse. She lands on the current page. This looks exactly like Gov.uk looks today. But she knows that actually she can use her identity verification system to log in and get more personalized information. And that's what she does. This is how Gov.uk looks like after she logs in. So as you can see here, some things have happened, right? So A, we are now in that trust ecosystem I told you about. We have some verifiable credential with proofs because thanks to her account, we were able to check those things. So we know that she has already, she receives already these kinds of benefits. And we were able to actually reassemble the content dynamically to point her exactly to what she has eligibility for. So we can already link those things. But we also know, thanks to the fact that we have structured the content in the backend in a granular enough way, we can also check that some things could be also available for her. We just need to verify another credential that we haven't verified yet on her account. And this is what WK could give her the possibility of doing. And that's what she does. She clicks on that, check if you're eligible. Again, we can replay the things we know about her. Again, this one wanted to be privacy-centric, so we wanted to give her the possibility of checking what we know about her. And then she can go and verify, finally, that credential. In this case, HMRC. Here, I'm showing who are the entities in that trust ecosystem I told you about. In this case, Anne is the holder and a subject. She's doing something about herself. GovWK account, but that's what it was called, but the account behind this is the issuer, and HMRC is the verifier, because we trust that HMRC will have the response to that. What happens? Thanks to that check, we have automated the decision, because knowing that that thing is true, that piece of data is true, we can actually send her straight to the apply now, which is what now looks like a start page on GovWK. But we were able to automate a lot of that and reassemble it in a much smoother journey without her having to read through and figuring out, am I eligible for this? Should I check first that? And so that's what she does. She goes on DWP. Something that we haven't mentioned, GovWK, it is really just the gigantic taxonomy that allows users to go into each service. So we don't control what happens. Sorry for we, it's not we anymore, but I still say we a lot. So GovWK doesn't control what happens when users go on DWP. They can just signpost people on DWP. So stuff happens on DWP, but again, we are in a trust ecosystem, so DWP can send us another credential back. And so back on GovWK, we know that that application was successful, and we can add another piece to the general picture of Anne. And I think that's it. That was
a couple of questions for you. First question, how do you envisage personalization will change for better or for worse with the introduction of AI?
It's a great question. I think I am very keen for everyone to understand these concepts, because I think already the role of AI, or what AI can do, is generally misunderstood. So I'm afraid that there's going to be a lot of botched experiments, especially in an area like personalization, because people rely on signals a lot, but signals are not reliable. As Chris and Marina told us, but that you need to, there's a lot that GovWK doesn't know right now about users. And so trying to build personalization on that is, but I feel that there's already some chatter about how generative AI can do hyper personalization, and I'm like, again, it's predictive, it's probabilistic, it's based on statistics. It's not automated. A lot of this stuff is actually based on our thinking on graph technology, which is a way of actually representing specific rules. This thing happens because this thing happened. It's not like machine learning taking a punt. I think that you might be eligible for this. There's a high probability. No, that is properly coded in the backend as rules. So yeah, I'm not super optimistic. That's the short answer. Sorry, this was a.
It's totally fine. The final question before we go into a break, short break. This is from Dan. Proof, if it was ever needed that IA goes way beyond user interface, what you'd say is the relationship between IAs, tech, and data architects?
Beautiful. I think it's symbiotic, and if you can find the tech architects usually understand it. It's sometimes a little bit harder with the tech leads. Tech architects usually are my best ally. I think that when it's a symbiotic relation, magic happens, definitely. Bringing that user-centered view that I have, because we are very continuous to design.
We've had our final tech fail.
Yes. But yeah, I think it's definitely, there's a lot to explore in that relationship. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.